faces here today. This is great. I'm Jonathan Coe, one of the directors here at the Easton Historical Society Museum. I welcome you all today. This should be a very, very exciting show. Lori Pires.
Nice job.
Oh, wonderful. I mean, the Muratori thing, Michael, your uncle was my first boss at Sears.
Oh my God.
In 1970, when I was going to college, my first job, and Mike was there in the automotive room. Best guy in the world. I couldn't believe I saw the Muratori name. And I go, wow, is that Mike? So that's awesome.
Still around.
I've seen Mike. I saw him in Market Basket, I think, last year.
Okay.
Yeah. So welcome. Again, it's we have another open house. We've had some very exciting ones this year and last year. I would ask everybody when you leave or after the presentation, which is going to be about an hour. We have ECAT here, so behave yourself, or you're on film, just to let you know. But please sign in. We have a guest list here on the front. When you leave, make sure you do sign your name, because if we get over 10 people, Ken pays me some money. So, I'm paid by the hour. It's really good hourly. So, but please look around the museum. We've had a lot of great changes. Take a look at the kitchen. We've had a new kitchen put in with some funding from Kevin Williams' family. It's fabulous. You can actually, for those that can walk up these stairs, and be careful, we have a walk of history. It's all pictorial history up the stairs to the top of the second level. Can't go any further, but that's you'll see some of the pictures there. Oh, fabulous. It'll bring back a lot of memories. So I welcome you all. We have refreshments back here. We got coffee, we got some spring water, a lot of great refreshments. We have cold drinks. I'm leaving them in the refrigerator. It's in the kitchen, so go back and see and get a drink, all right? So please do that, all right? So without further ado, I want to introduce our president. I'm the vice president, so I try harder. So I want you to give Ken Michael a big welcome.
Thanks, John. Your effort for the day is outstanding. We're all set. So, as John said, I'm Ken Michael. I'm the president of the society. I want to welcome you all. I'll add to what John said in terms of, I think this is going to be a great presentation today. Hats off to history. Lori Pires. I can't pronounce the other names, so I'm not even trying. But I do want to welcome all of you, and it's really nice to see you all. And I hope you all come in again, because we're open often. As some people would not know. Whenever you see the flag outside that says open, we're open. You see some lights on inside, we're open. You happen to see movement, we're open. So, just come on in. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the show over to Lori because she knows what she's doing and I don't. Hey, that's the answer.
I don't think I need this. I'm a mom,
Grab it.
so.
Grab it. Okay, grab the mic.
Lori.
We'll just have
Trust me, I can talk quite loud enough. If you can't hear me, just let me know. Hi, my name is Lorraine, and I have been collecting hats for over 50 years. I'm going to talk somewhat today about the history of some hats and a few stories about those headpieces in my collection. My very first hat was when I was 11 years old. I read a book about a boy that always wore a different hat, and I thought that was interesting. So my parents took us to Disney, and they bought me Mickey Mouse ears. And I do still have these today, but this was the very first hat I decided in my collection. And now I have over 500 pieces, over 50 years later. The first drawing of the hat is found on a cave wall in Thebes, Egypt. It depicted a man wearing a conical shaped hat. And that drawing dates back to 3100 BC. Then in 1991, there was the discovery of Otzi the Iceman. Otzi was found between the Austrian and Italian border, and he is Europe's oldest intact mummy. He was dated back to between 3100 and 3400 BC. The reason I mention Otzi is because he was wearing a bearskin hat. So, as you can see, hats have been around for a very long time. They have represented fashion, style. They represent fun. When my kids were growing up, this was always their favorite hat because it did this. Okay. Hats also, of course, were the military, their occupations. So many occupations are known from the headwear. You remember when nurses wore these, or McDonald's workers wore these? You can't get people to go to work these days. Can you imagine telling them they have to wear this when they get there? And we are definitely not talking politics, only in the sense of a hat. For years I had this cute little cat hat, dye it pink, it becomes a political statement, it makes the front page of Time magazine. I'd like to point out, when we talk about occupations, of course, we have conductors, police, airline pilots, even the Schlitz beer truck driver had a hat. But I do like to point out the fire helmet, because this is a very specific design that has never changed in all the years. The material has changed. This is an old leather one. But the elongated back was to keep them protected from the water, from debris falling. And I wish, as a mail carrier for 27 years, walking a mail room, sometimes I wish we had a little more protection than one of these. I often wish in the weather that they'd issue us one of these. So before I get into a lot of the history, I would like to share one of the stories how I got my French mail cap. So about 10 years or so, my daughter and I, she's my helper over there, we were in France, and we were initially in Paris. So we went to one of the post offices and talked to the clerk, and I explained to her I wanted to trade. I had brought a United States of America hat with me. I wanted to trade it with a mail carrier for his hat. First of all, they don't work in the same building, but then she says, oh, that's not allowed. It's in the manual. Absolutely, they cannot sell or transfer any part of their uniform. It's in the manual. Okay. A few days later, we were in a different post office, and I tried the same thing and talked to the girl, and absolutely not. It's in the manual. They cannot do that. Well, the last day of the trip, when this little village of Rouen, and my eagle-eyed daughter says, Mom, there's a mail carrier coming down the hill, and it's not wearing a hat. I said, oh, I see it. It's in his cot. So we got close enough, and I can speak a little bit of French. I said, bonjour, je suis un facteur États-Unis, which is hi. I'm a mail carrier in the United States. Well, I think he thought I was his long-lost sister. He gave me a hug, and then explained that I collected hats and I would love to have his. So lucky for me, he did not read the manual. He just handed me a hat. Now, twice more, well, he was so good about it, I took the USA hat out of my backpack and I gave it to him. So twice more during the day, Selena and I were walking around, and both times we see this French mailman in his full uniform wearing the United States of America. That's one of the reasons why I collect hats. They're a lot of fun. The other reason is the history. I really had to study up, because you see the town historian is in the back there. So, let's start. Excuse me, girls. I'm going to talk about what I consider to be some of the iconic hats. They've been around for hundreds of years and still are today. So this style hat, the scally, the newsboy, the flat top, this style dates back to the 1300s. In 1571, Parliament passed a law that every male over the age of 6, except for royalty, had to wear a woolen cap on Sundays and holidays or face a fine.
Oh my God.
Now, the only reason for that really was to promote the wool trade. But that lasted on the books for about 25 years. Eventually, they repealed the law. they've been wearing it for so long, the gentleman liked wearing this type of hat, gave him a sense of camaraderie. And I see what's going on. And so, now I'm gonna tell you about your hat, Ed. So, when the Irish immigrants came to America, they brought this style of hat with them. Well, a lot of them worked along the shipyards and along the docks. They started getting a reputation for gambling and fighting and drinking. So people began to refer to them as scallywags, or scallywags, or scallycaps. And that's where the term comes from today. We still keep today. The next hat I like to talk about, which is one of my favorites in history, is the top hat. In 1793, there was a gentleman by the last name of Dunnage, and Mr. Dunnage was a milliner in England, and a milliner makes women's hats. I'm sorry, he was a hatter. I apologize. He was a hatter. Milliners do make women's hats, and they can be men, but men that make hats for men are hatters. So, in 1793, I get all that. In 1793, he made a top hat style hat, but nothing really came about from it until 1797, when John Hetherington made the same design and style, top hat, and he wore it out of his shop in London down the main street. Well, it said that he caused so much commotion, a police officer stopped him and fined him for disturbing the peace. But there was also a reporter for the London Times that witnessed the whole thing, and he wrote about it on the front page of the paper. The rest, as they say, is history. Everybody knows anybody wanted a top hat. Of course, it was expensive as far as hats go. It was made predominantly with beaver fur, and then with silk, plush silk rather. But if we think in history, in our history, who wears a top hat? Every U.S. president, up until Kennedy, except for Eisenhower before him, wore a top hat for his presidential inauguration. In fact, Kennedy's hat and gloves are on display if you go to the Kennedy Museum heading into Boston. That's a pretty interesting place. J.P. Morgan had a specially made limousine with an extra tall roof, so we could ride in it with a top hat. He was also the model, if you will, for on the Monopoly board game, the Uncle Rich Uncle. That was from J.P. Morgan. The top hat, if you look at President Lincoln, the 16th president, when he was assassinated in 1865, he wore the tallest of the three styles. It was called the stovepipe, even though he was over 6 feet tall. And as a lawyer by trade, he would keep his important papers in the hat. But when he was assassinated, the War Department took possession of his belongings from that night, and with his wife Mary's permission, it took about 2 years, but the hat was donated to the Smithsonian. And when it got there, the secretary of the Smithsonian thought that the assassination was still fresh in people's minds, and he didn't want to put it out on display. So it sat in a basement closet for 24 years. Eventually it was lent out for an exhibit about Lincoln, and then when it was returned, the Smithsonian put it on display, which it still is today. I brought this case just to give you an example. This is from the late 1800s, but to show you what people went through, like we wouldn't leave the house without getting dressed. This was getting dressed, was to wear a hat. Now, we can't talk top hats without talking about the Mad Hatter, right?
Yeah.
Now, the symbol on the side, the 10/6, that stood for 10 shillings and 6 pence, the supposed price he paid. You asked me that earlier. But the term, are people familiar with the term, he's mad as a hatter?
Oh, yeah.
It actually dates back to Turkey, when hundreds and hundreds of years ago, they were making clothing and headwear out of camel fur. And they were using, believe it or not, the camel's urine to cure that fur, so it would bind tightly together. Well, over time, that process made it over to Europe, and the hatters there were making hats of not just camel fur, beaver pelt, rabbit fur, and they were using their own urine to to cure the pellets. Sorry. So after a while, they were using their own urine, but after a while, there was a factory in France, and the management noticed that there was one worker who was moving at a much quicker rate than everybody else. Come to find out, he was being treated for syphilis, and a component of his medication was a form of mercury. So out with the urine, in with the mercury. Now, these hatters are working in windowless buildings, there's no ventilation, they're literally being poisoned. So the mercury is making them shake, forget things, he's mad as a hatter. That's where the term came from. And in Danbury, Connecticut, which at one point was considered one of the hat capitals of the world, they actually had the term the Danbury Shakes. Now they outlawed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they outlawed mercury in hat making in other countries in Europe. But we didn't even outlaw it here, even though we knew the detriments. We didn't outlaw it until 1941. We needed the mercury to make detonators for the war. Now, in 1814, there was a famous magician in England. His name was Louis Comte, and Mr. Comte owned his own theater. He also did performances for the king, and it would be the first time anybody ever heard a magician say, "Watch me pull a rabbit." You know there was free magic in it. That was in 1814. In 1849, because one of the issues they had with the top hat, of course, wearing it out to the theater or to an event with such a tall piece of headwear, the gentleman owning it would have to hold it in his hand, bless you. Would have to hold it throughout the performance. So, in 1949, I bought that on purpose so you can see the metal inside, but Antoine Gibbis modified the top hat. He put metal springs inside, so you could just drop it down. It became known as the Gibbis or the opera hat, and you can now slide it under your seat during the performance. Having fun so far?
Yes.
Okay. Now, so the top hat had a great career, very prestigious, a lot of famous people.
Yes.
Then, in 1949, this was 1940. 1949, there was a gentleman in England, and he was a wealthy landowner. His name was Mr. Coke, C-O-K-E. Mr. Coke had quite a few employees, and he wanted them to dress appropriately. And part of that attire was a top hat. Well, they're tending to their livestock, they're mending fences. Top hat is not the most conducive hat to wear when you're horseback riding. So he went to the oldest hat company in the world, Lock & Company, which is still there today on St. James Street, and he went into the owner, and he told them he was looking for a hat with a much lower crown, sturdy, fit good on his riders' heads. They gave the job to a couple of brothers, whose last name was Bowler. And this is another example. This is the same idea as a top hat.
Wow.
This one has a bowler in it. But the bowler I'm going to show you was given to me about a week ago from a good friend. Thank you, Kathy. This was her dad's. And this is a bowler that was made at Lock & Company, which is pretty cool. This is very old. Not calling you down. Now, you think of the bowler, the Prime Minister of England, Winston Churchill, wore a bowler. The bowler was actually considered the hat that won the West, not the cowboy hat that hadn't been invented until 1865. But the bowler, if you think to some of the old TV shows you've watched, you see the bankers, you see the shopkeep owners, they're all wearing bowlers. And in Butch Cassidy, a bowler. Bat Masterson wore a bowler. So you have the good guys and the bad guys. In 1920, I always thought this was kind of funny. In 1920, there was a group of British railroad workers working in Bolivia. And they were sent shipments of bowlers to protect them from the sun and such. Well, when they arrived, they were all too small. what do you do with boxes and boxes of boulders that don't fit the gentleman's heads? You tell the Quechuan women of the area that this is high fashion in England. And it worked. They sold out of all the boulders, and to this day, if you look up the Quechuan women, they have the beautiful dresses and skirts, and they literally top it off with a boulder. Now, what were the women wearing? The women weren't quite as much honestly. They predominantly wore bonnets, and the men and women also wore straw hats. But the bonnets, dating the late 1700s to the early 1800s, a lot of the women had those tall cotton wigs. There was a type of bonnet called a calash. And this has only left my house, this is the third time, because it was a historic society, I decided to bring it. It is called a calash, and these are bonnets, but they fit over the women's wigs at the time, and they would put whalebone or wood so that it would fit. This one does have wood in it. It's over 200 years old. This is the oldest piece of my collection.
So does it stand on their shoulders?
Oh no, this went right on the.
Oh, it rests on the.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean the back part, sure, that would sit back here, but just a regular bonnet with the ties. Years ago, I had done a talk, a presentation for the Easton estate in Milton, and to thank me, the curator took us on a tour of the historic New England building in Haverhill, Mass, which was amazing. I mean, it was like a block long and stories high, and she was telling us that they had a calash in their collection, but they didn't know it at the time. They had a woman come in that was going to appraise some furniture for them, so she was walking through the furniture area, and she saw this large, it was a calash, and she asked the curator, why is that piece in with the furniture? The curator said, well, somebody donated this baby carriage hood, but we don't have the baby carriage. It was that large. They had it on display, and I've seen it. It was amazing. It was all intact, and it was like this wide. But she said, no, that's not the hood of the baby carriage. That is actually a bonnet. So it was kind of funny that they went through that. Another type of bonnet that they wore, of course, there was no heat in the homes, and you're familiar with the nightcaps. The men and women both would wear nightcaps to bed to warm your body. That's where you get the term today. You have a drink before bed, you have a nightcap to warm yourself. I mentioned that bonnets as well as straw hats was something that the women were wearing, men also with a straw. If anyone is familiar with Foxborough, Massachusetts, at one point was considered the straw hat capital of the world, not the United States, the world. So this is just an old hat box from Foxborough hat. But unfortunately, there are no more shops for hats there. But this hat is about 100 years old. Just to give an example, this is also from Foxborough. Now they attribute the fact that they were called the straw hat capital of the world to a 12-year-old girl named Betsy Metcalf. Now Betsy lived in Rhode Island. This is in 1798, by the way. She lived in Rhode Island, and she walked by a store window that had a straw hat on display, and she loved it, a bonnet. And she wanted it so badly, but of course she couldn't afford it. She was 12 years old. She learned to braid straw. She taught herself how to braid straw until she braided it into a bonnet that she could appreciate, and she wore it to her school, the day school in Rentham, and a lot of her friends there, I mean, they loved it, so they asked her to teach them how to do this. A lot of those girls lived in Foxborough, so they began this, and actually they began this cottage industry. All these little houses and then shops started springing up, because now this was a time when women couldn't make your own money, you didn't have any property, but here they were making and selling hats. Then there was a gentleman, the last name was Carpenter, in Mansfield, who was buying up the hats, taking them into Boston and selling out on a daily basis. So eventually they built a bigger factory and they had more women employed, and that's how Foxborough became the straw hat capital of the world. Now, in 1809, there was a woman in Connecticut. Her name was Mary Kice. And Mary decided she was going to braid straw and silk to make hats. So she did this process, and then she thought, I'm going to apply for a patent. Well, women really had no rights in 1809, but there was nothing in the patent law that said a woman couldn't apply. She applied, and Mary Kice was the first woman in the United States to get a patent, and it had to do with making straw and silk hats. At the end of the 1800s, actually in 1896, there were a couple of women, they were cousins, and their last names were Hall and Hemingway. Hemingway was a character. She, at one point, they were very well off, by the way, the Blue Bloods of Boston area, and at one point, Booker T. Washington was denied any hotel rooms in the whole city. So she said, well, you can stay in my house. I mean, that caused quite a stir. But she was very well known. She got a hold of the books with all the prestigious names because she read an article about how the birds in the country were being decimated for the plumage. And in fact, in Florida alone, 95% of the white egrets were wiped out for millinery purposes only. You couldn't walk down the streets in New York without seeing not just feathers, but whole birds on hats. There was a woman that actually made a dress out of 3,000 hummingbirds. I mean, it was just, so Ms. Hemingway actually read this article. She called her cousin, Minnie Hall, and she said, we need to do something about this. So they started having tea parties. I mean, they didn't have the right to vote. They didn't have nightlife like the men did. So they hosted daytime tea parties, and eventually hundreds and hundreds of women joined in their cause to the point where they formed the Massachusetts Audubon Society. So that was formed because of two women standing up against the hat trade against milliners. And eventually led to the Migratory Bird Treaty, where you couldn't transfer or sell birds across the state lines. And then, of course, the National Audubon Society from that. But all because of these two women. So now we're kind of rolling into the very end of the 1800s. And there is a hat, there's actually a play written for a woman, an actress, Sarah Bernhardt. And in the play, Sarah wears a soft felt style hat like this. And her name in the play is Princess Fedora. So the fedora is actually made and marketed for women before it is for men. But then in 1924, Prince Edward in England decided he liked that style of hat. So he had them fashion, this is not his, he had them fashion that style of hat for men. A little sturdier maybe, not quite as light as this one. And of course his subjects wanted to emulate him, so the men began wearing fedoras. Now, 1920, women earned the right to vote. So, they're feeling this newfound freedom and this sense of self-esteem. They begin actually cutting their hair short. And then that trend leads to the cloche, which is just a small hat that fits over their short hairstyle. So the women are now wearing cloches, the men are wearing fedoras. And when you think of a fedora, I tend to think of myself, Prohibition, Al Capone, it's the gangster style. But this actually stayed pretty popular throughout the years, the fedora. In fact, in 1981, Harrison Ford, forget him wearing a fedora, right? Indiana Jones. So the fedoras, the cloche, and then we move into some of the 30s, the 40s, where women's hats in particular are becoming so fashionable. There was one milliner between the two world wars. She was considered one of the top milliners in the world. Her name was Elsa Schiaparelli. These are two of her pieces here. And Elsa Schiaparelli was born in Italy. She moved to London and then to the States. Then she went back to when she was married, and they had a daughter, and when they were in the States, they got divorced. So she ended up moving to Paris with two friends that she was doing some millinery and dressmaking work with in the States. And when they got to Paris, she continued this line of work until she opened her own shop in the late 1920s. Now, Elsa was very creative. I mean, if you ever read about this woman, she made, if you had a yellow dress, at the time you'd wear just a metal zipper. Well, she had a yellow zipper with the yellow dress, so it matched, so everything matched. She also was very surrealist. She worked with artists like Salvador Dali was one of her many partners. In fact, her first design with him was a little round compact that looked like the rotary dial on a phone. She also made a pocketbook that looked like a telephone. So she was very creative, and she really hit the fashion world by storm, not just millinery. But then, in 1939, France declared war on Germany, and Elsa came back to the States with her daughter. She did send money and other items to the cause in France. In fact, she did make one voyage back on her own, and she would sew, she sewed money in the linings of her hats to bring back over. Now, when the war ended, she did go back to Paris, tried to reopen her shop. She did a little bit here and there. She actually made a design for Mae West in Moulin Rouge in the early 1950s. But then in the mid-50s, Elsa's shop closed. But when her shop closed, there was another milliner on the scene. He was born in Germany, but he went by the name Mr. John. Mr. John was considered the milliner to the stars. Mr. John had a pretty unique way of doing things. When a woman came into his shop in New York and pretty much demanded she needed a special hat right then and there, it had to be special, it had to be now. So he sat her down and he actually built the hat on her head. But when he was done, he told her the price. She complained so much how much it cost, he said, just a minute. He literally disassembled it, handed her the pieces and said, $3.59, you build it. Now, Mr. John passed away in 1993 at the age of 91, and when he did, he was quoted as saying, I don't know what I'll do when I get to heaven, because I don't think even I can improve on the halo. One more milliner I'd like to mention. Her name is Ann Dinkin. She was a milliner for Bonwit and Teller. It's a big department store, like a Macy's. She worked in New York. And my mom actually got me this hat. Thanks, Mom. But what I love about this is it came with a provenance. So this hat says, it's checked off, $18.50. And it says, I can get you any bonnet you like, my love. Just choose the one you want. Now, $18.50. She was not selling that from New York. When my daughter and I tried to find information about Ann Dinkin, all that kept coming up was Jewish delicatessen. And I'm like, why can't I find information on this lady? Finally, come to find out, we found out, yes, she was a milliner for Bonwit and Teller. But after World War II, her and her husband moved to Japan. He got one of the very few permits that MacArthur was allowing to work and sell from Japan to the States. So he made a fortune selling transistor radios back here. Meanwhile, Ann had her little hat shop, and she was selling hats, that's like this one. But her husband and her got divorced in the early 1960s. So in 1965, she decided, I need to get more money, I need to do something else. She somehow opened the one and only Jewish delicatessen in Japan. Not only did she hook on the first delicatessen, but she somehow secured the rights, exclusive rights, to import pastrami. So she had no competition. And she once told the person interviewing her that she taught the employees to be rude, just like a Jewish delicatessen in New York. And she said, I'm doing that to protect myself, because now no one else will hire them. So we talked about the milliners and up to the 50s. When we hit the 50s and then into the, oh, I have to show this picture, sorry Mom. This is can always look at this after, but this is a photograph from the 50s. My mom is in it, but so are a group of other children. They're all wearing hats. The kids, the teachers, they go to the circus, but they're all dressed up and they're wearing a hat. And it's just to show you how prevalent hats were in our society up through the 50s. Now in the 60s, there started to be a slight decline. Some people, the men in particular, attributed that to President Kennedy. He wore the top hat for his inauguration, but after that, he just was not a hat wearer. And in fact, when he was on the campaign trail, it started to rain, and he walked into one of the stores, and he bought a hat, and it made the front page of the paper. Jack bought a hat. Like it was big news back then. So he was even getting hats sent to him for free from different hat companies, hoping he'd wear a hat, but it just wasn't his thing. And women, of course, began wearing like little whimsies, as basic as you could get for headwear. And of course, they wear these into church as well. And then you hit the 1960s and then into the 70s. That was the most dismal time for headwear, was in the 70s. Women, remember, there's a direct correlation with women and hats. In the times of the calash and the bonnet, women had the big wigs. Now in the 20s, they cut their hair short, they had a calash. Well, now in the 60s into the early 70s, they're starting to tease their hair. They're dyeing it. That's now their fashion statement. So these hats are archaic, really, they're not necessary. And when that came back, a resurgence of hats was in around 1980s. And they attribute that to Princess Diana. I mean, the Queen always wore hats, but Princess Diana, she was a people's person, if you will, and women wanted to emulate her. So especially over in Europe, England, they're all wearing the hats, and that style eventually comes across to the States. So we started wearing hats again in the 80s. And again, men continued to wear hats like the fedora. They started to come back in the forefront with TV shows like Downton Abbey and Mad Men. So now you're seeing hats again. A lot of musicians will wear a hat. A lot of them like this basic, this is called a pork pie. Because of the center here, they think it looks like a folded pork pie. And the women are wearing, as Sabina has, a fascinator. So this was very popular in England. In fact, when Prince Harry got married years ago, it was on their wedding invitations that the woman must wear a hat or a fascinator. I mean, I watched the Derby just to see the hats. So I'm telling you, the hats are back in style, and I noticed those of you that don't have one, that need one, look at these cool Easton historical hats. Yeah, I mean, where can you get 2 hats for $25, folks? I hope I read that right. Is that right? Let me double check that. Yes.
35 for one.
15 each.
35 for one.
Yeah, so hey, if you need a hat, you want to support the guys here and the gals, why not? Okay, speaking of caps like that, years ago, the kids and I, my kids, they're 30 and 32, but we were on a trip in New Zealand, and on the plane, I mean, New Zealand, we're so far away from here, and what do I see? The first thing I noticed is this hat. Okay, ladies, maybe it wasn't the first thing I noticed, but eventually, I noticed the hat, okay? I mean, it's a Patriots hat. They come to find out he had no idea who the Patriots were. He bought it in England on sale on clearance, which is what the hats are probably going for now. But if you remember before Kraft built the new stadium, the Patriots were actually going to move, and they were going to go to St. Louis and become the Stallions. So the NFL made up these official Stallions hats, and they were destroyed, except for this one, when they didn't make the move, obviously. They do have this shirt at the Hall of Fame at Patriot Stadium, but they don't have the hat. I always said I'm holding out for season tickets. But first I want to see how the new quarterback goes. Okay, I think you'll find these little items a little interesting. These little mini hat boxes. And what's in them? A little mini hats. These, I don't know why they call them salesman samples. I mean, you would not go into a hat shop and try and sell them a hat based on this.
Right.
But that is what they are referred to sometimes. But they were actually gift certificates. And they used them even up, like in the 40s. They were very prevalent then. But you would give the person, you would purchase the hat, but because you don't know their size, you just give them this as a gift certificate. They would take it into the corresponding store and trade it in. Very cool. Okay, moving along. Excuse me. Now, you all look way too young to remember these. College dings. Hands up, come back there. These were worn by college freshmen. It was supposed to be a type of camaraderie thing, but all it really was so the upperclassmen knew who the freshmen were and could beat them up. But here's a photo of my alma mater, Stonehill. It shows a couple of freshmen actually wearing the hat. And, yeah, these eventually pretty much went by the wayside, but there are actually a few colleges today, believe it or not, that still give them out to their freshmen. And again, it was supposed to be so that they had a sense of camaraderie and the upper class would see them wearing these and try and help them out. But if they knew they were freshmen and they weren't wearing this, they had to sing the song of the school, or they had to do a tap dance or something to that effect. I guess they considered it hazing and kind of phased it out. Now, a couple years ago, I was in Brimfield. It's a great antique show, if you haven't been. And I saw these Amish bonnets on a table. And they're very rare because it goes from the infant. It's kind of like those Russian nesting dolls. And trust me when I say there's various sizes in here. The girl's name was Amanda. So I saw them in the booth. And I was like, oh God, I haven't seen them before like that. And I went up to the gentleman manning the booth, and I said, oh, what are those, bonnets? And he said, yeah, my wife got those. Who wants bonnets?
Oh.
I was like, yes. So, got a great deal on these. This one, this was in Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. It was, a friend of mine actually took care of a gentleman that was in his late 90s, and he worked for Ringling Brothers. He was a performer. So he has a lot of paraphernalia. He donated most of it to the museum in Florida, but they didn't want the hat because it's kind of molten. And I said, oh, I'll take that. And again, Sarah and I were looking up information on it, and it had a name of a company in New York that made hats for the circus as well as for performances on Broadway. So we kept searching the name in the hat as well, and it's a very small photo, but it shows two twin girls, women, and they did acrobats for Ringling Brothers, and they have hats tucked under their arm with that same color feather. But it's really fun looking up the history and finding out where these things came from. And of course, speaking of history, German World War I helmet, and it is engraved 1915 Berlin. Now this is artillery, the spike on top, this is called a pickelhaube. If it were artillery, this is infantry, if it was artillery it would have a ball on top. But this is 1915, and at one point the Germans realized this was not the most conducive element for war, so they recalled a lot of the helmets and they just lopped that piece off And then they restamped, this one is 1915, but they did restamp the leather as 1916, and they shipped them out again without the point. And then I bring this one, Gloria, thank you, Ken. This is a Las Vegas showgirl hat with a couple of my friends got me that I thought was really amazing, and it's really heavy. I mean, you're welcome to pick this one up if you want. It's a very heavy hat. This is a vintage item. This is how they would stretch your hat. You just turn this wooden, this wooden bit. Just put it inside the hood of the hat and turn it to make it stretch out. This is show and tell right now, folks.
Yeah.
This was in the movie Jewel of the Nile. It was worn by one of the bad guys. And then the one I didn't buy, because I was so young at the time and couldn't afford it, and I always kicked myself, was the original Mary Poppins hat.
Oh.
That's the one that got away. You always had that one that got away? That was it. This is from the late 1800s. This is Iroquois Indian. It's all hand beaded. And they would actually make them. I mean, they're beautiful. They'd sell them to the tourists up at Niagara Falls. And speaking of beautifully made, this is a Chinese Mao, M-I-A-O. The piece underneath, the red, that's all hand embroidered. The Mao women were taught that embroidery at a very young age. It's very intricate. And then it's adorned with hand-hammered birds and flowers. They wear them for festivals and for weddings and things. When I got this hat, I just had a couple of minor surgeries. I was home recovering, and two of my best friends decided they're going to cheer me up. Let's go to the vineyard for the day. So they took me to Martha's Vineyard, and I saw this hat in the window. And of course, I fell in love with it, and being my two best friends, they did talk me out of buying it. They said, you're not getting any overtime right now. You can't buy that hat. I went home without it. Well, I thought about it for 3 long days. And then I called my boyfriend and said, hey, you want to go to the vineyard? So, got the hat. And another funny story with this hat, about 10 years after that, so a few years back, I'm delivering my mail route, which at this point was in Mansfield, and I'm talking to the new shop owner that moved in. Her name is Leaf, and she owns Leaf Boutique. And we're discussing, and of course, the topic turns to hats. And I'm telling her about some of them in my collection, and I mentioned a Chinese Mao. She says, I bet I know where you got that. I said, how did you possibly know where I got that? She said, Martha's Vineyard. I said, what? It was her mother's store.
Oh.
She grew up on the vineyard, and that was her mother's shop.
So you could have gotten a discount.
I mean, so always thinking. One of my favorite milliners nowadays is her name is Dina, but her hat brand name is Cha-Cha's House of Ill Repute. So we went to a hat association dinner. Yes, there is such a thing in New York at the Boathouse in Central Park, and I had this hat on, and this woman comes up to me and says, you're wearing my hat. And I'm like, oh my God, it's Cha-Cha. It was like meeting a star for me. So I did have her sign inside, and we've actually met many times since. In fact, on my birthday, this is also a Cha-Cha, but a couple of years ago for my birthday, thank you, Tim, we went to Cha-Cha's studio in New York, and I was able to design a hat with her, a custom hat. And it's my 2 favorite colors, purple and orange. There's a kiwi bird to commemorate the trip with the kids to New Zealand. And yeah, so this is it's the most perfect fit because of this. So that's a pretty cool hat. Let's see. Oh, and then the best thing about collecting is people give you all these cool gifts. So a couple of years ago for Mother's Day, I always wanted a hat from this company in Japan called Bread Hat Company. And they have hats that look like loaves of bread. This one happens to look like a cake. and they don't ship to the United States. So I had shown the photo of it to my son once. Well, I don't know how he did it, but he called the owner of Kent Bread, and of course he does not speak Japanese. He ordered the wrong one initially, but he was able to order the hat that I wanted. Then he called the Japanese shipping company and had it shipped from Japan here, and I got it for Mother's Day.
Oh,
And it's Savannah. Sorry, Savannah. I'm gonna finish up with my favorite story. It involves my Bermuda police hat. And I'm going back many, many years ago. My parents were in Bermuda on vacation. And my dad went up to one of the policemen there, and he asked them where they got their hats. Who issued the hat? And the officer said, well, that's issued from the armory. You know, say Mr. Smith is the one that issues the hats. So my dad hailed a cab, and him and my mom get in the cab. They drive towards the armory, and the cab driver is explaining to him, I can't get you in there. I'm not allowed. It's a restricted area. And my dad said, that's all right. Just get me as far as you can. How far can you get me? He said, well, I'll take you to the gate. Well, they get up to the gate, and the gentleman comes out with a machine gun, and there's Dad in the back of the cab, rolling down the window, and he sticks his head out, and he says, Mr. Muratori from the United States of America, I'm here to see Mr. Smith. Oh, okay. Well, they let him through. So now they come to a second gate, and it's pretty much the same scenario. Mr. Muratori from the United States, and they let him through a second time. He got a machine gun. They just open the gates, let him in. So my dad, I remember him telling the story, and he's watching the back of the cabbie's neck beat up with sweat, and he's telling him, I'm not supposed to be in here. My dad, oh, don't worry about it. You'll be fine. They let us in. So they get to the stairs of the building, and Dad, I think he left my mom in the car for insurance, so the guy didn't drive away. He left her in the car, and he went inside. So he goes into the building, and he tells the secretary, I'm here to see Mr. Smith, for just a minute, I'll tell him you're here. To show Dad in. And Mr. Smith says, oh, nice to meet you. They exchange pleasantries. What can I do for you? My dad says, well, my daughter collects hats, and I really want to get her a Bermuda police hat. So this Mr. Smith looks at my dad and he said, how did you get in here? I let me in at the gate. So he says, you know what, for the sheer fact that you're here in front of me, I am going to get you a Bermuda police hat. And my dad, not being pushy, said, imagine everything. Yes, Mr. Murray. Imagine everything. So he says, I can't just hand it to you, but give me your paperwork for your flight. There will be a hat waiting for you at customs. And he gave me this little paper. So my father says, well, that's so nice of you, but what can I do for you? Mr. Muratori, you've done enough. You taught me I need to upgrade my security. I'm just going to say one more time, everybody looks great in the hat. I see some out there, I think you look awesome. But whatever you do, do not buy it when you're drunk. Thank you for coming. No? Okay, good.
This is the first time I've ever seen you with bareheaded.
Yeah, you know.
Are you
Wait a
going
minute.
to design any more hats? That's the question.
I have another birthday in September, dear. We should see. I don't know.
Or how about a book?
A book? No, I just like reading them.
You did a great job.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you.
sorry.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I appreciate you all coming too.
Oh, it was
Thank
great.
you.